So Donald Trump just demanded what could become one of the largest government bailouts in modern transportation history, a staggering $573 billion federal rescue package for North American railways. But Canada didn't just refuse. They fired back with a response so blunt, so economically calculated, that it's already sending shockwaves through Washington, Ottawa, and the global freight industry. And here's the part most headlines are missing. While Trump allies argue the U.S. rail system is on the brink of collapse, Canadian officials are quietly preparing countermeasures that could reroute billions in freight traffic, shift continental trade corridors, and potentially undermine one of the biggest infrastructure gambles in decades. This isn't just about trains. This is about supply chains, energy exports, cross-border trade under the USMCA agreement, and who controls the future of North American logistics. Right now, in real time, a political and economic standoff is unfolding between Washington power brokers and Canadian policymakers that could reshape how goods move across the continent. And what I'm about to show you reveals why this $573 billion demand may have triggered consequences no one in Trump's camp expected. Hit that like button and subscribe, because the deeper story behind this railway showdown explains exactly how a single political demand could ignite a massive North American trade confrontation. To understand why this situation escalated so quickly, you need to step back and look at the fragile state of North America's rail infrastructure right now. Because this crisis didn't appear overnight. Over the last 2 decades, freight rail has quietly become the backbone of the continental economy. Roughly 28% of all U.S. freight moves by rail, according to the Association of American Railroads, carrying everything from Midwest grain to Canadian oil to consumer goods headed for major ports. In 2023 alone, U.S. freight rail moved more than 1.6 billion tons of cargo, representing nearly $2 trillion in economic value. But beneath those numbers, the system has been under mounting strain. Aging infrastructure, labor disputes, shrinking rail workforces, and an explosion in demand tied to post-pandemic supply chain realignments. Between 2017 and 2024, the number of major rail workers in the United States dropped by almost 30%, falling from roughly 150,000 employees to just over 105,000, largely due to efficiency programs introduced by major carriers like Union Pacific, Norfolk Southern, and CSX. Those cuts boosted profits, but they also created fragility. When derailments, weather disruptions, or labor strikes hit, the system has far less redundancy than it once did. You saw a preview of that vulnerability in February 2023, when the Norfolk Southern derailment in East Palestine, Ohio, triggered environmental damage, federal investigations, and renewed scrutiny over rail safety standards. Congress responded with hearings. Regulators proposed tighter rules, but the structural problems remained. At the same time, rail demand has surged because companies are trying to shift away from congested trucking networks and expensive maritime shipping routes. That's where the cross-border dimension becomes critical. Nearly 75% of Canadian exports go to the United States, and a huge portion of that trade, including Alberta crude oil, Saskatchewan grain, and Ontario manufacturing components, travels through rail corridors that run directly into American industrial hubs like Chicago, Detroit, and Minneapolis. These rail arteries aren't just commercial routes. They're economic lifelines linking 2 economies that trade over $900 billion annually under the United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement, the trade deal that replaced NAFTA in 2020. And that's why Trump's proposal, the $573 billion railway bailout and restructuring demand, landed like a political earthquake. Because it doesn't just involve U.S. rail companies, it potentially rewrites the balance of power over North America's freight system, including routes that Canada heavily relies on. Ottawa immediately recognized the stakes. Canadian transport officials began emergency consultations with Canadian National Railway and Canadian Pacific Kansas City two rail giants that together control more than 32,000 miles of track across North America. While Washington debated the bailout, Canada started preparing a response designed not just to reject the proposal, but to reshape the economic battlefield entirely. And that brings us to the moment when this dispute exploded into a full-scale political confrontation, because what happened next caught nearly everyone off guard. The turning point came during a closed-door policy meeting in Washington earlier this week. According to multiple transportation policy insiders and congressional staff briefed on the discussion, Donald Trump's allies began circulating a draft proposal that stunned even some Republican lawmakers. The document called for a $573 billion federal intervention plan aimed at restructuring the U.S. freight rail system over the next 10 years. That number alone immediately raised alarms. To put it into perspective, $573 billion is larger than the entire 2021 bipartisan infrastructure law's rail allocation, which dedicated about $66 billion to passenger and freight rail combined. It is also roughly equivalent to the annual GDP of Sweden. And the plan wasn't just about maintenance. According to early policy outlines shared with transportation committees, the proposal included three major components. First, a massive federal financing package to modernize rail infrastructure, including electrification of major freight corridors and the expansion of high-capacity cargo routes across the Midwest and Gulf Coast. Second, partial federal backstopping for financially stressed rail operators after a series of costly derailments, lawsuits, and insurance spikes that have battered balance sheets at companies like Norfolk Southern and Union Pacific. Third, and most controversial, a restructuring authority that would allow federal regulators to intervene in cross-border rail traffic agreements. That's the part that immediately caught Ottawa's attention, because under current agreements tied to the United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement, USMCA, cross-border freight routes operate under a delicate framework of regulatory cooperation. Canadian officials quickly realized something critical. If Washington gained expanded authority over rail traffic corridors connected to U.S. infrastructure upgrades, Canadian exports could become dependent on American regulatory decisions. In other words, control of the rail bottlenecks could shift south of the border. Within hours of the proposal circulating on Capitol Hill, the Canadian Ministry of Transport in Ottawa called emergency consultations with Finance Minister Chrystia Freeland and Prime Minister Justin Trudeau's economic advisors, and their response was anything but quiet. Late Tuesday evening, Canadian officials began signaling a counter-strategy that industry analysts are describing as shockingly aggressive. Instead of negotiating within the U.S. framework, Canada began exploring ways to bypass the potential American rail choke points entirely. The centerpiece of that strategy, a dramatic expansion of West Coast export routes. Officials in Ottawa began accelerating infrastructure planning tied to the Port of Vancouver, the Port of Prince Rupert, and the newly expanded rail corridors connected to Canadian Pacific Kansas City Railway, the company formed after the $31 billion merger between Canadian Pacific and Kansas City Southern in 2023. That merger created something unprecedented. For the first time, a single railway network connected Canada, the United States, and Mexico with a continuous freight corridor stretching nearly 20,000 miles. And Canadian policymakers now see that network as leverage. Because if Ottawa shifts more exports westward and southward through Pacific shipping lanes and Mexican rail connections, U.S. Midwestern rail hubs could lose billions in freight traffic annually. According to early estimates from TD Economics and the Canadian Chamber of Commerce, rerouting even 15% of Canada-U.S. rail trade could redirect tens of billions of dollars in logistics revenue away from American rail operators. That possibility immediately triggered alarm inside U.S. transportation circles. Executives from several major freight carriers reportedly contacted members of Congress warning that a prolonged political standoff could fracture the integrated North American rail system that has evolved over nearly 40 years since the 1980 Staggers Rail Act deregulated the industry. But the political temperature was already rising. On Wednesday morning, Canadian officials issued what many analysts described as a diplomatic warning shot. In a carefully worded statement, Canada's Transport Ministry emphasized that any unilateral U.S. policy affecting cross-border freight mobility would require reciprocal economic adjustments. That phrase, reciprocal economic adjustments, immediately lit up trade circles, because in the language of international trade policy, it's often shorthand for retaliatory economic measures. And suddenly, what began as a domestic infrastructure proposal had escalated into something much bigger: a potential North American freight power struggle. While Washington debated a historic bailout, Canada was quietly preparing to rewrite the map of continental trade routes. And if that happens, the economic ripple effects could hit everything from agricultural exports in the Midwest to energy shipments from Alberta to manufacturing supply chains stretching from Ontario to Texas. But here's the part that makes this story even more explosive, because when you look closely at the political timing, the financial numbers involved, and the strategic leverage both sides are deploying, you start to see a deeper battle unfolding beneath the surface, a battle over who will control the infrastructure that moves the North American economy in the next 30 years. And the deeper you dig into that fight, the more staggering the implications become. To really understand what's happening here, you have to look past the headline about a $573 billion railway bailout and examine the strategic incentives driving both sides of this confrontation. Because infrastructure battles are rarely just about infrastructure. They're about control, leverage, and long-term economic dominance. And right now, the United States and Canada are staring at a potential restructuring of North America's freight power structure. Let's start with the American side of the equation. Trump's allies have framed the proposal as a national competitiveness emergency. According to policy drafts circulating among several transportation committees, the argument is that the U.S. freight system, which moves roughly 40% of long-distance cargo nationwide when rail and intermodal traffic are combined, is approaching a breaking point. Rail congestion has already become a measurable problem. Data from the Surface Transportation Board shows that average rail shipping delays in several major corridors increased by 18% between 2021 and 2024. Meanwhile, the cost of rail maintenance has surged due to inflation in steel, fuel, and labor. Track replacement costs alone have climbed more than 35% since 2019, according to the Federal Railroad Administration. Then there's the geopolitical layer. U.S. strategists increasingly view freight infrastructure as a national security asset, especially after supply chain shocks during the COVID-19 pandemic and semiconductor shortages that disrupted global manufacturing. In 2022, the White House Council of Economic Advisors warned that strategic choke points in transportation networks represent economic vulnerabilities. That warning didn't just apply to ports, it applied to rail corridors as well. So when you hear Trump-aligned policymakers arguing that the U.S. must secure and modernize its rail network, the underlying message is that America should not rely on infrastructure decisions made outside its borders. But that's precisely where Canada enters the picture, because Canada occupies a geographic position that gives it enormous leverage over continental logistics. Look at a map of North American freight routes, and you'll notice something important. Several of the most critical trade corridors, particularly those moving agricultural goods, oil, and manufactured components, run through shared rail networks between the United States and Canada. One example is the Chicago-Toronto Freight Corridor, one of the busiest rail trade routes in the hemisphere. Every year, that corridor helps move over $250 billion worth of goods, including automotive components essential to the North American manufacturing ecosystem. Then there's the Alberta Energy Corridor, where crude oil shipments from Canada's oil sands frequently move south by rail into U.S. refineries when pipeline capacity becomes constrained. During periods of pipeline congestion, Canadian rail exports of crude have reached over 400,000 barrels per day. That's the equivalent of roughly 2 fully loaded oil supertankers every week. Now imagine what happens if those flows are redirected. If Canada shifts even a portion of that traffic westward toward Pacific ports like Vancouver and Prince Rupert, the economic consequences would ripple far beyond rail companies. Midwestern logistics hubs could lose freight volumes, U.S. refineries could face tighter supply options, and trucking routes that depend on rail intermodal transfers could become more expensive. This is why Canada's response wasn't simply rhetorical. Ottawa understands that infrastructure is leverage, and the country has been quietly building alternatives for years. Consider the Port of Prince Rupert expansion, completed in phases between 2017 and 2024. That project increased container capacity by nearly 50%, allowing more Asian imports and exports to bypass traditional U.S. West Coast ports like Los Angeles and Long Beach. At the same time, Canadian rail companies have invested billions into improving east-west freight routes that connect the Pacific Coast with central Canada. Canadian National Railway alone spent over $3.5 billion on capital upgrades in 2023, much of it focused on expanding freight throughput capacity. These investments weren't random. They were part of a strategic push to diversify Canada's export pathways, reducing dependence on U.S. transit routes. So when Trump's allies floated the idea of federal authority over cross-border rail agreements, Canadian policymakers interpreted it as a potential structural shift in power, and they moved quickly to signal that they have options. Now here's where the political calculation becomes even more complicated, because inside the United States, the bailout proposal is already triggering divisions. Some fiscal conservatives are questioning the sheer size of the number. $573 billion would represent one of the largest single infrastructure commitments in American history. For comparison, the interstate highway system, launched in 1956, cost about $500 billion in today's dollars. The 2021 Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act allocated $550 billion in new spending across multiple sectors. So a rail-focused package of similar scale is bound to spark intense debate. Transportation economists are also split. Some argue the investment could modernize freight capacity, reduce highway congestion, and lower long-term shipping costs. Others warn that federal intervention in private freight rail, which has been largely deregulated since the Staggers Rail Act of 1980, could distort markets and create regulatory uncertainty. And uncertainty is something rail investors dislike intensely. Shares of several freight carriers historically react sharply to policy changes that affect pricing rules, operating flexibility, or infrastructure obligations. That's another reason the Canadian reaction matters, because markets pay attention to cross-border stability. If investors begin to believe that political disputes could disrupt the integrated North American rail network, capital investment decisions could shift rapidly. Companies might favor ports, trucking fleets, or regional logistics hubs instead of rail expansion. That would undermine one of the central arguments behind the bailout proposal, that rail should remain the most efficient long-distance freight mode. Now step back and look at the bigger geopolitical picture. Across the world, major economies are pouring enormous resources into transportation infrastructure. China's Belt and Road Initiative has financed rail corridors stretching across Asia and Europe. The European Union is investing heavily in transcontinental freight rail modernization under its 10T Transport Network Plan. Even Mexico has accelerated freight rail upgrades tied to industrial growth along the U.S. border. So North America faces a strategic question. Should the United States attempt to dominate continental logistics infrastructure through massive investment, or should it preserve the collaborative framework that has allowed the U.S., Canada, and Mexico to operate one of the most integrated trade systems in the world? That debate is now unfolding in real time. And if you think this is just a policy dispute between Washington and Ottawa, think again, because the outcome could shape global supply chains, commodity markets, and international trade routes for decades. Before we get to the potential consequences, though, there's one more layer you need to understand, and it's the part of the story that many political commentators are barely discussing. The economic ripple effects that could hit ordinary businesses, workers, and consumers across North America. That's where this story becomes far more personal and far more consequential. Now let's bring this down from the geopolitical chessboard to something much closer to home. Because if this rail confrontation escalates, and right now the signals from both Washington and Ottawa suggest it could, the effects won't stay confined to transportation policy. They'll ripple across supply chains, energy markets, agriculture, and consumer prices. Start with agriculture. The United States and Canada together produce enormous volumes of grain that move primarily by rail. According to the U.S. Department of Agriculture, roughly 70% of U.S. wheat exports and nearly 60% of corn shipments rely on rail transportation to reach ports and international buyers. Many of those shipments pass through rail hubs in Minnesota, North Dakota, Montana, and Illinois before moving toward either Pacific ports or Gulf Coast terminals. If cross-border rail coordination breaks down, even temporarily, those shipments could slow dramatically. And when agricultural logistics slow, global food markets react quickly. In 2022, rail congestion during harvest season caused wheat shipping costs to spike by more than 15% in some Midwest corridors, according to the Agricultural Transportation Coalition. Farmers felt the impact almost immediately. Export buyers shift to other suppliers, prices fluctuate, margins shrink. Now look at the energy sector. Canadian crude oil production averages about 4.9 million barrels per day, according to Natural Resources Canada. While pipelines move most of that oil, rail becomes essential whenever pipeline capacity tightens or maintenance disruptions occur. In fact, during several pipeline bottlenecks in 2018 and again in 2022, rail shipments of Canadian crude surged above 350,000 barrels per day. Much of that oil travels south to refineries in Illinois, Texas, and Louisiana. But if Canada begins redirecting more exports westward toward Pacific shipping routes, American refiners could face tighter supply options. That matters because refinery configurations are built around specific crude types. Canadian heavy crude plays a major role in several U.S. refining systems. Shifting those flows even slightly could influence regional fuel prices. Now consider manufacturing. The North American auto industry operates on an extremely tight logistics schedule. Factories in Michigan, Ontario, and northern Mexico exchange parts through rail corridors that move engines, transmissions, electronics, and steel components. The Chicago-Detroit-Toronto manufacturing triangle alone supports hundreds of thousands of jobs tied to integrated cross-border supply chains. If rail reliability drops or new regulatory barriers emerge, companies may need to redesign logistics networks, a costly and time-consuming process. That could slow production or increase prices, or both. And finally, there's the consumer impact. When freight systems become less efficient, transportation costs rise. Those costs eventually show up in the prices people pay for everyday goods, from appliances to groceries to construction materials. Transportation economists often use a simple rule of thumb. When freight costs increase by 10%, retail prices for certain goods can rise by 1 to 3%, depending on the industry. That may sound small, but across an economy the size of North America's, where the United States and Canada together generate over $27 trillion in combined GDP, even small logistical inefficiencies can translate into billions of dollars in added costs. Which brings us to the real question. Is this railway showdown just a temporary political clash, or are we watching the early stages of a fundamental shift in how North America moves its goods and builds its economic alliances? because the answer to that question will determine whether this story fades quietly or becomes the beginning of a much larger economic realignment. And that's exactly where we're heading next. Step back and look at the bigger picture for a moment. What started as a dramatic proposal, a $573 billion railway bailout and restructuring demand tied to U.S. freight infrastructure, has rapidly evolved into something far more consequential, a strategic test of who ultimately controls the arteries of North American commerce. Because railroads are not just transportation systems, they are economic command lines. Every train that leaves the Canadian oil sands, every grain shipment rolling through the Midwest, every auto part crossing the Detroit-Windsor border represents a tiny piece of a continental machine that moves over $3 billion in goods across the U.S.-Canada border every single day. And that machine only works when the system is predictable, when policies are coordinated, when trade partners trust that the rules governing cross-border infrastructure won't suddenly shift. Right now, that trust is being tested. Washington is debating an infrastructure strategy that could centralize enormous power over freight corridors. Ottawa is signaling it has alternatives and the capacity to redirect trade flows if necessary. Markets are watching, rail companies are watching, and global supply chains are watching, because if this confrontation deepens, the outcome won't just determine the fate of a bailout proposal. It could influence where ports expand, where factories invest, and how commodities move across the hemisphere for decades to come. Now, I want to hear from you. Do you think massive federal investment is the only way to secure America's rail infrastructure? Or could this kind of intervention risk destabilizing one of the most integrated trade systems in the world? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. And if you want analysis that goes deeper than the headlines, the kind of political and economic breakdown you rarely see on mainstream broadcasts, make sure you hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications, because this railway standoff is still unfolding, and the next move could reshape the entire North American economic map.